The Peter Schiff Show.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Mint Mobile. Get your new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/gold. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Today's podcast is also sponsored by Constant Contact. Constant Contact's award-winning marketing platform has powerful tools that make it easy to grow your audience, engage your customers, and sell more to boost your business in just a few clicks. You can launch a marketing campaign that's tailored to your business and goals that includes email, social, SMS, and more. Start growing your business today with a free trial at ConstantContact.com. Good evening, everybody. Another Sunday night live podcast, this time from my basement in Connecticut. I'm finally back here in Connecticut. I'll be traveling for the rest of the summer, although some of the time is going to be spent here in Connecticut. In about 10 days or 12 days, I leave on the Real Estate Guys Summit at Sea. I mentioned that, so I'm hoping to see some of my podcast listeners on that 8-day cruise that's going to leave, I think, on the 15th of this month. The land seminar begins on the 13th in Fort Lauderdale, and then we embark on an 8-day cruise of the Dutch islands, the ABC islands in the Caribbean, Aruba, Bonaire, and Caraco. So that should be fun. My whole family will be on that trip, including my son Spencer, who some of you know from prior Bitcoin encounters that I've had with him. But in any event, so I want to get started by talking about what happened during the week. You know, there's that old adage, sell in May and go away. Well, not this May. I think there was some selling early in the month, but it finished on a strong note. In fact, the Dow was up almost 600 points on Friday. I think it was the strongest day of the year for the Dow. In fact, the NASDAQ, which had been down pretty sharply earlier in the day, even managed to recover those losses by the closing bell. And I think what the catalyst for the Friday rally was more bad economic news, which is, encouraging investors that the Fed is going to cut rates. I mean, we all know, everybody knows the Fed is going to cut rates. The only question is, how soon are the rate cuts happening? We also got inflation data on Friday that wasn't worse than expected, but it wasn't any better. So it wasn't good news. In fact, from my perspective, it was more evidence of stagflation. That is the worst possible news for the market. Certainly, it's the worst news for the bond market. It's the worst news for the dollar. It's the best news for gold. Yet gold not only didn't rally, it sold off about $18 on the day. It initially rallied on the bad news. I mean, gold was up in the morning by about the same amount, but it sold off. And I think because of the investor optimism, right? When people are just very enthusiastic about the stock market, they lose their enthusiasm for gold. But let me go over some of the data points that came out on Friday. The big number that everybody was talking about was the personal income and spending number, because contained in that number is the PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. That is the Fed's favorite way to measure inflation. Now, I think it's the favorite way because it's the least accurate. It's the inflation measure that most understates what's actually happening to prices. That's why the Fed likes it, right? Because it's not honest. And if the Fed focuses on PCE, it's easier to achieve its so-called 2% target than if it focuses on other measures of inflation that are less inaccurate. I mean, none of them are accurate. They all, by design, understate inflation. It's just that the PCE, by design, understates it the most. And so that number came out pretty much exactly as expected. They were looking for up 0.3. We got up 0.3. They were looking for the year over year PCE to be up 2.7. It was up 2.7. The core, which strips out, food and energy, that was supposed to be up 0.2, and it was up 0.2. And the year over year again, exactly as expected, expecting up 2.8. We got up 2.8. The markets liked this because the numbers weren't worse than what they had expected, but it doesn't matter. Even if they matched expectations, the expectations were not good. If the Fed's target is 2%, and even the measure of inflation that understates it the most is at 2.7 or 2.8, that's still a long way to go to get to 2%. Remember, at 2.7, 2.8, we're much farther above 2% than we were below it. When we were below 2% by a lot less than 0.7 or 0.8, the Fed had interest rates at zero. The Fed was doing quantitative easing because they said, oh, this is terrible. Look how far below 2% we are. We're at 1.5. We're at 1.6. We need to pull out the stops here. We need emergency measures to get inflation up to 2% because we're so far below that target. Well, we're now above the target by much more than we used to be below. Yet this means that we don't have to hike rates. In fact, that we can cut rates, that we've already won the inflation fight. What the data should be proving is that the Fed hasn't done enough. That inflation is not going back down to 2% from 2.7, 2.8. In fact, all of the evidence suggests that inflation is going up, that we've stopped going down, and we're going to be heading higher. So the market's still got this wrong if they breathed a sigh of relief because it could have been worse. Yes, it could have been worse, and eventually it will be worse. But it wasn't better, and it really needs to be better. It needs to be a lot better to justify the rate cuts that everybody believes are coming and that the Fed still insists are not only coming, but they're appropriate. And they couldn't be more inappropriate. What the Fed should be doing is hiking rates, not because the economy is strong, but because inflation is strong. And in fact, we got some very weak economic data on Friday that came out later in the morning. We got the Chicago PMI. Now, the forecast was for an improvement in May from the April number, which was pretty bad. The April number was 37.9. And the expectation was for 40.8, which would have been an improvement, but still a weak number. Instead, the actual number came in at 35.4. That is a horrific number. That is lower than the low end of the range, which went from a low of 38.3 to a high of 44. So some people expected a number as high as 44. Other analysts that were pessimistic thought it might be as low as 38.3. And instead, we got 35.4, which way below the low end. In order to find a Chicago PMI this low, it was 4 years ago in early 2020, about May of 2020. Now, what was going on in May of 2020? Well, in case you don't remember, it was COVID. It was the lockdown. We shut the entire economy down. And so you have to go back to an economic shutdown to find a Chicago PMI that was this low. What does that tell you? They're talking about this strong economy. We have an exceptionally weak economy that has only been weaker when it was shut down completely. So not only do we have much stronger inflation numbers than what the Fed estimated, but the economy is actually a lot weaker. Despite all this talk about a strong economy, the evidence supports a weak economy. And in fact, we got more evidence of a weak economy with the international trade deficit numbers, which were horrific. Again, nobody talks about these numbers but me. No one seems to care. But the merchandise trade deficit exploded in April to a multi-year high it was supposed to be 92.5 billion, which would have been a little bit worse than the 91.8 billion from March. Well, they revised the 91.8 billion up to 92.3 billion. But the April deficit was 99.4 billion. A huge widening of the trade deficit because of a 3.1% increase in imports and only a 0.5% increase in exports. Now, again, this evidences a weak economy. The economy was too weak to produce the goods that we need. And so we relied more heavily on imports because our weak economy couldn't produce the stuff we needed. And so we had to rely on stronger economies abroad to produce that stuff. But not only does the exploding trade deficit in goods evidence a weak economy, but it evidences more inflation because we're not producing as much stuff. So we have to import it. But less stuff means higher prices, just like more money means higher prices. We have more demand, we have less supply. And of course, eventually the dollar is going to collapse under the weight of all these trade deficits. You know, once upon a time, when currency traders actually cared about these trade deficits, the dollar would be clobbered on a day with this bad a trade deficit. No one cares anymore. But ultimately, these trade deficits are going to weigh on the dollar. The dollar is going to fall, and that's going to push up prices even more because now we're going to need more dollars to buy all these imports. And in fact, foreigners won't need as many dollars to buy the stuff that we make. And so that'll bid up the prices of the stuff that we export as well as the stuff that we import. So this was a weak economic number, weak inflation, but we also got the GDP number, which is specifically supposed to be right about the economy. This was the estimate for Q1 GDP. And by the way, the Atlanta Fed revised down on Friday quite a bit their forecast for Q2 GDP. And I think there's a lot more downward revisions coming because they're still way too optimistic on what they think is going to happen in the second quarter or happen because it's basically over. But for Q1, the estimate was 1.5% GDP growth. And that would have been a little bit less than the 1.6% that they estimated last time they released the numbers. Well, we ended up getting 1.3. So not only is it 0.3% below the original report, but it's 0.2% below what they thought it was going to be. So that's a weak number. And the personal consumption expenditure component was also quite a bit weaker. It was originally reported at 2.5. The estimate was 2.2, and we got 2.0, which again was below the low end of the consensus range. So more weak economic data. In fact, what we got throughout the course of the week was weak economic data. The Richmond Fed manufacturing came out earlier in the week. That was at 0. I mean, it was actually not as weak as it was forecast to be, but 0 is still weak. The Dallas Fed manufacturing was minus 19.4. That was worse than the minus 14.5 from the prior month and worse than the minus 14.4, which they expected. And the production index sank to minus 2.8. The prior month was up 4.8. So that was a bad number. So over the course of the week, we continue to get evidence that the markets are completely ignoring, that the Fed is completely ignoring, that the economy is weak. The only thing that's strong is inflation. And the markets don't seem to care about that either. Anyway, we got a quick commercial break, so stick around. We'll be right back.
My favorite part of spring cleaning is the clarity afterwards, making me wonder, how have I been living like this? It's kind of like finding out that you've been overpaying for your current wireless plan when Mint Mobile offers plans for just $15 a month with the purchase of a 3-month plan. It's time to switch to Mint Mobile today and enjoy unlimited talk, text, and data for just $15 a month. In fact, when it was time to get my son Preston his own phone, Mint Mobile was the perfect choice. Forget about the steep monthly fees and overages that you get content with your current wireless plan and make the switch to Mint Mobile's premium wireless plans, starting at just $15 a month. Choose any Mint Mobile plan, which includes high-speed data with unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network. You can even keep your current phone and number when you switch and bring over all your existing contracts. Ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's limited time deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/gold. That's mintmobile.com/gold. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/gold. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on the first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plans. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
All right. Well, while the media, of course, was focused on the May gains in the stock market, they really didn't pay any attention to the gains in the precious metals market, because as far as I'm concerned, that's where the significant move was, because we saw gold during the month of May rise to a new all-time record high, even though it ended the month on a bit of a decline. But if I look at the price right now on Sunday night for the price of gold, we're still trading above 2,300 or 2,328. So a solid breakout in the month of May. And more particular or more significant is the breakout in the price of silver, which went north of $30 an ounce and never looked back. It got as high as $32.50, I believe, and then pulled back. But it never even got back below 30. It's held up above 30 and closed the month above 30. So that is extremely significant. But I think the strength in the stock market is causing investors really not to pay attention. And of course, all the continued noise surrounding Bitcoin. This time, it's really not Bitcoin, but Ethereum, because everybody is now focusing on the fact that the Ethereum ETF is going to be approved. And there's a whole bunch of these ETFs that are in the queue, because the same companies that are making money on Bitcoin ETFs, because they get to charge fees to basically custody nothing. Well, the same companies that are charging to custody Bitcoin, well, they're going to charge the same group of people to custody Ethereum. But, I think it's the bulls are missing the point that there isn't a whole lot of money on the sideline waiting to buy Ethereum. I think the money that whoever bought these Bitcoin ETFs, that money is already in the Bitcoin ETFs. That's the crypto money. That's the crypto allocation. It's not that people are like, well, now there's Ether. Let me buy a similar amount of Ether. I already put $10,000 into Bitcoin, so let me put another $10,000 into Ether. I think if that individual wanted to put $20,000 into crypto, it would already be in Bitcoin, right? People aren't holding back, waiting for the Ethereum ETF. I think they already put their chips on the table and they got them on Bitcoin. Now, if the same companies roll out these Ethereum ETFs, I think what investors are more likely to do is move some of their Bitcoin chips and slide them over to the Ethereum ETF, because that's their allocation. Hey, I got $10,000 in crypto. I put it all in Bitcoin because that's all there was. Now there's two. Now there's Bitcoin and there's Ethereum. Well, let me shift $5,000 over to Ether, and I got both bases covered, right? I'm betting on two horses instead of one. That's what I think is more likely to happen. So why is that bullish for Bitcoin? It's not. It means that a lot of Bitcoin is going to have to get sold in order to free up the money to buy the Ethereum. And so I don't see this as another big catalyst for a huge move up in Bitcoin. It could be a catalyst for a big move down in Bitcoin, which is going to drag down Ethereum, right? So I don't know that this is bullish for any of the cryptos, but it is a lot of noise. And it is kind of sucking the oxygen out of the room with respect to gold and silver, because again, Wall Street sees Bitcoin as digital gold, as an alternative to gold, as an alternative to silver. So the fact that all of these news coverage, in fact, I read a story that came out that basically said that most financial advisors were not willing to recommend the Bitcoin ETFs, which is not news to me. It's something that I always said was going to happen. I didn't see how financial advisors were going to recommend these products. It's just not worth it to them because they're exposing themselves to a lot of liability. If the ETFs go down, they can get sued. And it's very easy to sue your stockbroker. It's very easy to sue your advisor. And so why go out on the limb? I just didn't think there was any reason. I didn't even think most of the firms would allow their reps to recommend this stuff. And they haven't done it. And so I was watching the CNBC did a report on Friday about this story that came out about the fact that the advisor community is not recommending it, because the whole point supposedly of the Bitcoin ETFs was so the advisor community could recommend it. That supposedly there was all these investment professionals that really wanted to allocate to Bitcoin, but they didn't have a way of doing it within the regulatory framework that they operated. And so we just needed these ETFs, and now all these advisors were going to start allocating money to Bitcoin. Well, it's not happening. And so what was the point of all this, right? It was just to facilitate another vehicle for gambling. Yeah, there are some investors, look, they buy GameStop, they bought AMC. I mean, there are people that'll buy anything. They don't care, right? They just going to jump on any bandwagon. They think they can make some money. And that's what happened with the Bitcoin ETFs. That's all you got. And again, I don't think there's a new pool of money waiting around for the Ethereum ETF. It's the same money. But the reason I'm bringing it up now really is because people should be talking about $2,400 gold, $2,300 gold. People should be asking the question, why is gold at this price? And if it's at this price, what's going to stop it from going to a higher price? Or why is silver above $30 an ounce? What's going on? What is that telling you? Because these, again, are monetary metals. They're not just commodities. They're special in that they are monetary alternatives to fiat currency. They are alternatives to the dollar. Now, interest rates have gone up a lot recently in the United States, right? You could get 5.5% on treasuries. Not too long ago, treasury yields were basically zero. You couldn't get anything on 90-day treasuries. But the price of gold is much higher today when you can get 5.5% than it was when you got 1/4%. What is that telling you? What is that telling you that the markets think about that 5.5%? They don't care. The markets aren't being fooled by that number because they'd rather own gold. They're more interested in owning gold now when interest rates are over 5% than they were when they were practically zero. And that's because the gold buyers understand that that 5.5% yield is BS, that real yields may actually be lower now than they were when nominal yields were near zero, because inflation is so much higher. But not only is inflation so much higher now than it was when rates were zero, but the anticipation or the expectation of where inflation is going to be in the future is so much higher, especially since basically both political parties have obviously thrown in the towel on fiscal responsibility. Nobody cares. Nobody even wants to propose a committee to study the problem of the deficit. Certainly, the Federal Reserve doesn't want to weigh in on it. No, they refuse to say, oh, we got to stay in our lane. That's what Powell said. Oh, I can't talk about the budget deficits. We just take it as it comes, right? We just take whatever fiscal policy Congress wants to hand us, right? We're indifferent. We don't really care. Well, the Fed doesn't care. Why should anybody care, right? Biden doesn't care. Trump doesn't care. Nobody cares, right? I mean, so we, at least in the past, some people pretended to care. Now, I knew it was all BS. That didn't matter what they said. It was all politics. But at this point, they don't even bother with the pretense because no one even thinks it's a problem anymore because the problem has gotten so big without a supposed catastrophe that it's supposedly no longer a problem. And people are tired of being warned about the debt because nothing has happened. And of course, now you got the popularity of the MMT that are coming out and saying, you see, look, we don't need to worry about the debt. It's just a number. Who cares? Right? And so that's the mentality. Well, that is what's driving the buying in gold and silver. And this is just getting started, right? This is a huge wake up. What's happening? And so we've seen the original or the initial breakout to new highs in gold, above 30 in silver, and nobody has noticed it. It's basically happened without any fanfare, completely in obscurity. And to me, that's what makes it that much more real. Because even though gold is at a new high, it's a contrarian investment to buy it. See, normally when something's at a new high, it's because everybody's buying it. Right. So it wouldn't be a contrarian investment to buy a new high, right? You would be doing what everybody else is doing. You would be jumping on the bandwagon. But you can buy gold today and silver and be a contrarian, even though gold is at an all-time record high. That's how skeptical people are, right? There's an old saying that a bull market climbs a wall of worry. Well, that's what you have in gold. People are not optimistic. They're still pessimistic. And again, that's why we haven't seen any of these Wall Street analysts this month, even though we had a surge in the price of gold and silver during the month. Nobody came out and recommended any of these mining stocks. Nobody upgraded any of these mining stocks. I mean, the last movements that were made were downgrades. They downgraded Newmont. They downgraded Barrick. The two biggest gold companies in the world were downgraded when gold was at 2,000. It's moved up 20%. And if you remember, the rationale for the downgrades was that there was no more upside in gold. Everybody assumed that 2,000 was the top, that we couldn't go any higher. And so there was no point in buying gold stocks. What was I saying at the time? The 2,000 was the floor. There was no point in selling gold stocks because gold couldn't go any lower. We were at the floor. And now we're 20% higher approximately, or we got to 20% higher. But none of the companies that downgraded these stocks have come back and said, oops, my bad. We were wrong. And now we're going to raise the recommendation back. No, they haven't even acknowledged that they got anything wrong yet. So we still got a long way to go in this rally, I think, before we have any kind of meaningful pullback. I mean, the pullbacks we're seeing now are not meaningful. I mean, they could be meaningful to somebody who's just day trading and trading in futures, but for real buyers, right, of people who are buying gold and silver, it means nothing. There's not going to be, I don't think, a big enough pullback to wait. People should just be buying the metals. They should be buying the miners. And unfortunately, they're not getting this these recommendations from the financial community. Anyway, I want to take a quick break, and then when I come back, I want to talk a little bit of politics because we've had a very big political week with the conviction of former President Donald Trump, and I want to discuss the U.S. Judicial system and what that means on the other side of this break. So stick around. I'll be right back.
Feel like you need a marketing degree and an extra day in your week to successfully market your small business? Let Constant Contact do the heavy lifting for you. Constant Contact's award-winning marketing platform has powerful tools that make it easy to grow your audience, engage your customers, and sell more to boost your business. Now, in just a few clicks, you can launch a marketing campaign that's tailored to your business and goals. That includes email, social, SMS, and more. You can sell more, raise more, and fast track your business growth. Plus, you can always count on Constant Contact's award-winning customer support for guidance along the way. So get going and start growing your business with a free trial at ConstantContact.com. Constant Contact, helping the small stand tall.
All right. Oh, so before I get into the Trump conviction, I did want to remind everybody about Schiff Sovereign. In fact, if you're starting to look at the podcast, you'll notice we have the Schiff Sovereign logo up there. And if you're not getting our free email newsletter that comes out pretty much every day, we've got something that we put out. If you're not getting that, you want to go to schiffsovereign.com and sign up by giving us your email address, and you'll be on the list to get the free newsletter. But we also have a premium letter, Schiff Premium. There's actually a few products, but the lowest tier, the least expensive product to buy is premium. And that's $9 a month. You can get I think the first month there's a money back guarantee if you're not satisfied. Not only do you get my podcasts, commercial free, if that's something that you feel is important, that's part of it. But you also get the newsletter, the premium newsletter that comes with a lot more information, a lot of valuable information that you're not going to get if you're just subscribing to the free newsletter. So you should sign up for the free one for sure, but I would encourage people to take the opportunity to take a membership to the paid newsletter. It's only $9 a month, but there's a lot of value that you're going to be receiving for your $9. And this is, a good way to stay in touch with me. I've wanted to have a newsletter, to be part of a newsletter for a long time. And the main reason I didn't do that was because of FINRA, right? Because I was a registered stockbroker. And that really tied my hands with respect to stuff that I could put into a financial newsletter. But now that I am no longer in that club, after 30 years, basically, of being a licensed stockbroker, as of the beginning of this year, I let all my licenses lapse. So I'm no longer beholden to them. And so I have a lot more freedom in the things that I can say and the things that I can write. And so that's, part of why I have this letter. In fact, I don't know, did I give up my FINRA registration so I could have the letter, or because I have the letter, I gave up the FINRA registration? I mean, I never really liked being part of FINRA. And again, I've always thought it was unconstitutional because I don't think that I should have to be a member of a government sanctioned club, right, organization, in order to practice a profession. But there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the government the authority, the federal government, to limit my occupations. To say that, hey, if you want to be a stockbroker, you need to be a member of this organization. And if you don't join this organization and pay its fees and subject yourself to all its rules and regulations, you can't be a stockbroker. Where does it say that in the Constitution? I mean, I have a right to be a stockbroker, right? I have a right to pursue happiness. And if I pursue happiness by being a stockbroker, what difference does it make to the federal government? And if somebody wants to hire me, if that's how they pursue their happiness, if they want me to be their stockbroker, who is the government to say, no, you can't hire Schiff? Because right now, if somebody wanted to use me as a stockbroker, they can't do it. It's illegal. I can't be a stockbroker right now. My own mother couldn't hire me as a stockbroker because I'm not registered with FINRA, right? As a stockbroker, my Series 7 isn't hung anywhere, right? That's all illegal. Anybody in this country should be able to be a stockbroker. If there's a firm that'll hire them or they can start their own firm, they shouldn't have to be a member of some organization. And if somebody wants to hire a stockbroker, they should be able to hire whoever they want. They shouldn't have to be a member of this organization. I mean, if you get bad investment advice, so you can fire your broker, go someplace else, right? I mean, we don't need the government. All this stuff is illegal. Nobody bothers to question why it's illegal, but because you have occupational licensing laws everywhere. You want to be a barber, you want to cut somebody's hair, you got to have a license. But these at least aren't federal licenses; they're state licenses. So the states can do it if they want, because the Constitution wasn't written to limit the power of the states, right? Their power is limited by their own Constitution. The Constitution was written to limit the power of the federal government. The federal government can only do what the Constitution authorizes to do. And it doesn't say it can, license any occupation. But the states, if they want to do it, but think about how ridiculous it is. Why should you need to have a license to cut somebody's hair? I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, to protect people from bad haircut? I mean, hair grows back. Who cares if you get a bad haircut? Just don't go back to the same barber, right? Go to somebody else. I mean, it's not a life or death thing. They even require licenses to arrange flowers, right? If you want to be a florist and take flowers and arrange them in a vase, you need a license. Why? Right? What? I mean, oh my God, I'm going to get a bad floral arrangement? I mean, how do we need government? Why do we need government to protect us from flowers that are not arranged properly in a vase? Who cares? And again, if you go to a florist and they give you a bad arrangement, well, then go to a different florist. I mean, how much competition is there in florists? And there'd be even more competition if you didn't have to be licensed to arrange the flowers. But anyway, my point here was not to talk about the ridiculousness of occupational licensing. I'm not even sure how I got into this tangent. Oh, yeah, because I was talking about FINRA. But I wanted to talk about this other travesty of justice. And that's what happened to Donald Trump over the weekend. So the jury came back in New York and convicted Trump on all 34 counts of this concocted campaign of falsifying government business records. Now, it wasn't a surprise to me that a handpicked judge who was specifically picked because he hated Trump and because he was a highly partisan Democrat whose daughter was a huge fundraiser for the Democrats, who has donated a lot of money himself to Democrats. They picked this guy. It wasn't like a random draw, like Trump just happened to get this judge. This judge was put in this position to make sure that Trump was convicted. And judges have a lot of power over a trial, right? They basically give the jury the instructions. And if you have a corrupt judge, he can instruct the jury in such a way as to get a conviction. And they also decide, what evidence comes in, what evidence doesn't come in, right? They can make it easy or hard to get a conviction. Now, normally a judge is supposed to be, neutral. He's not supposed to be biased. If he is biased, he's supposed to recuse himself. A judge is supposed to have enough integrity that if they know they're not, if they know they're biased, right, for whatever reason, they bow out. They say, you know what, I got some conflicts here. I can't be the judge. I'm not neutral, right? So get somebody else. This judge not only knew he was biased, that's why he got the job. He got the job because he was going to convict Trump or make sure that the jury. So this was not a real trial in the sense that they were looking for justice. In the U.S. legal system, the job, even of the prosecutors, is not just to convict somebody. The job is to make sure that justice is served. And justice might mean dropping the charges if you realize that the guy that you've accused of a crime is innocent, right? If you get a bunch of exculpable material, you're supposed to say, oh, we were wrong. The guy's not guilty. Let's let him go. right? But in today's, jurisprudence, it's like, well, we got to convict this person. We've charged them. We want to convict them. We don't care if they're guilty or innocent. We just need to win, right? We need to get this guy in jail. And certainly when you're talking about a former president and presidential candidate, Donald Trump. So the fact that a judge that was picked specifically because he didn't like Trump and a jury was picked out of a population of Trump haters in New York City, the fact that these biased Trump haters would convict Trump with a, hating Trump judge, right? That didn't surprise me at all. In fact, I would have been more surprised if he was acquitted. Now, a hung jury, maybe, maybe people would have thought, okay, look, they're not going to find 12 people corrupt enough to convict them, but they did. And, I think one of the reasons, and it had to do with the jury instructions, which have got to be the worst jury instructions since my father. My father, Irwin Schiff, always made a big deal, and correctly so, out of the fact that he was never really convicted of tax evasion because the judge instructed the jury that they could convict my father even if the government didn't prove that he evaded taxes. Now, because he went to jail for tax evasion. But the jury came back because they had been deadlocked for a number of days and asked the judge a question and said, hey, does the government have to prove that Mr. Schiff, illegally evaded taxes? Now, the answer to that question was obvious. Of course they have to prove it. That's what he's been charged with. The judge came back and told the jury, no, the government doesn't have to prove that. The judge said, if you think he did something else and you want to convict him based on that, then that's good enough. Or so, I forget exactly what it was, but it was ridiculous jury instructions. And the New England Journal of Taxation actually wrote it up. And they said, Mr. Schiff was not actually convicted of tax evasion. And they wondered if the law had been changed because this article said for all of history, tax evasion meant that you had to be convicted of an affirmative act of evasion. But here in the Irwin Schiff trial, the judge said that you can convict Irwin Schiff of tax evasion even if the government doesn't prove he evaded any taxes. And so they were saying, does this mean the laws have changed, right? Is it now like anybody can get convicted of tax evasion, even if they don't evade their taxes? And they basically said, well, no, we think it hasn't changed. It's just that Irwin Schiff was a tax protester. And so the rules were different for him, right? And they didn't really care, what that meant, because obviously my father is entitled to equal protection under the law. And just because he's a tax protester doesn't mean there's a different set of rules for him than everybody else. And the same is true of Donald Trump. Just because he used to be president doesn't mean that there's a different set of rules for him that doesn't apply to everybody else. But that's what's happening. We're not getting equal protection under the law. And in fact, the irony of this is the media and the Democrats are using what happened to Trump to try to show that nobody is above the law. You see, if you break the law, you can go to jail. You get charged, even if you're a former president. Well, the reality is, had anybody other than Trump done exactly what Trump did, they would never have been charged. He is only being charged because he's Donald Trump, because he was a former president. And I'm convinced it's not just because he was a former president. He is being charged because he's trying to be a future president. If Trump were not running for re-election, I don't believe these charges would have taken place. So what I think is happening is they're trying to interfere with the election. Oh, the irony, because that's what the left claims Trump was doing with the January 6th stuff. Oh, he was trying to interfere with the results of the election. No, he was just questioning whether those results were honest or not. He wasn't interfering. He just maybe demanded a recount, wanted to make sure that, he lost fair and square. That's not interference. That's trying to make sure that the results accurately reflected the votes, which every president has done. I mean, every time there's an election, the loser, hey, let's have a recount, or what about this, or was that fair? Of course, that makes perfect sense. But the people who have accused Trump of trying to rig the 2024 election or 2020 election are actively rigging before our eyes the 2024 election by trying to put the main contender for the president, Biden's chief rival, the presumptive nominee. And it's not just presumptive. I mean, he is going to be the nominee. There's nobody else. I mean, he's got all the votes. So he's going to be the nominee 3 or 4 days after the sentencing, right? They have the sentencing scheduled for just a few days before the Republican convention so that he could be, this convicted felon. In fact, everybody is saying, how can we elect a convicted felon as president? Well, we've got an unconvicted felon as president right now, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Biden has committed real felonies. And just because he hasn't been convicted doesn't mean he's not guilty, because they haven't had the integrity to charge him. But the stuff that Trump was accused of doing isn't even a felony. They had to make up a felony. The actual charge was a misdemeanor, right? Falsifying business records. That was a misdemeanor. And he falsified them allegedly so long ago that it's outside the statute of limitations to even bring the charge. So the only way they were able to trump up the charge against Trump was to claim that this misdemeanor was committed because of another felony. But there was no other felony. He was not charged, but the government claimed that there were 3 possible felonies that he committed. Yet they were able to introduce no evidence to prove that he committed any of these felonies. Yet in order for the jury to convict him of this crime, this misdemeanor, and convert it to a felony, the government had to prove that he committed one of these other felonies, which they did not prove. And in fact, the judge told the jury that we don't even have to prove it. All we have to do is prove that he intended to evade his taxes or intended to violate campaign finance laws, even if he didn't violate them, even if he didn't commit tax evasion. I mean, what the hell is that? So if you wanted to violate the law, if that was your intention, but it turned out you didn't even violate it, well, then you're still guilty. And it was actually worse. This is what the judge instructed the jury, because there were 3 potential felonies that supposedly he intended to commit. And the judge told the jury that you don't all have to agree on it, right? So there's 12 of you. If 4 of you think that he intended to commit one crime, but 8 of you don't believe it, but another 4 of you think he intended to commit a different crime, but 8 of you don't believe it, and then another 4 of you think that maybe he did this other crime, but 8 of you don't believe it, as long as you got 4 people 3 times, that's 12. So even if the government couldn't actually prove that he intended to commit any crimes, the jury can still find him guilty of committing those crimes. Not only was it not unanimous, but they didn't even have a majority. I mean, it was the most crazy jury instructions, at least as crazy as the jury instructions in my father's case. Now, hopefully, at least this time, it'll get overturned on appeal. I mean, my dad, his conviction should have been overturned, but it wasn't. And the Supreme Court, of course, didn't have the integrity to even hear the case. And the Second Circuit, a bunch of liberals rubber stamped the conviction and the jury instructions. But I think that the Trump case is so high profile that there's no way that this conviction is going to stand up. But of course, it will stand up long enough for the 2024 election, right? They're not going to be able to overturn the conviction before the votes are counted for the election. So the Democrats will have succeeded in branding Trump a felon. And so he will be running for office as a convicted felon. The only president, if he does get elected, that'll be a first. He'll be the only convicted felon to ever be elected president. In fact, he's the only president to be convicted of a felony, right, after he left office. But of course, this isn't a felony. The whole thing is a farce. It's a fraud. But it does highlight the point I've been making too, from my own experience, how corrupt our judicial system is. A lot of people, they have contempt for politicians. They don't like lawyers, but for some reason they like judges. Judges are just lawyers that have political connections. They're a lawyer who got appointed as a judge, and most of them are also politicians. So these judges are just as corrupt. And so in general, people have a high opinion of judges. They shouldn't. Most of them, they should have a very low opinion because they've really sold out America. They haven't done what they're supposed to do with respect to the law, with respect to the Constitution. They often let their politics rule their decisions and how they handle a court. And so in the case of Donald Trump, justice went out the window, and they weaponized the judicial system, just like they did with me, like they did with my bank. And some people say, hey, why do you keep talking about your bank? Well, because it happened to me. I got firsthand knowledge of this crime, right? Laws were broken by the U.S. government, Puerto Rican government. It even involved corrupt politicians in other countries, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, right? Corrupt politicians framed an innocent bank, even though they investigated my bank for 2 years and found that it did absolutely nothing wrong. They pretended that it did something wrong. They shut it down based on a lie so they can pretend that it did something wrong. I as a kick, I went on ChatGPT today because I was looking for any information, a transcript on the press conference. The day they closed my bank, which was 23 months ago. Now it's almost been 2 years. It was 23 months on Friday, right? And by the way, my bank customers, 23 months, no one's gotten a nickel. No, everybody would have had their money 23 months ago if regulators didn't put my bank into receivership. Nobody's account was in jeopardy. The bank was totally solvent. All the money was there. And I had a large company that wanted to buy the bank, that wanted to put even more capital in, that wanted to expand it, bring in new management, bring in a new board. Great for Puerto Rico, great for the bank, great for the customers, great for the employees. Why was the bank shut down? Why was a totally solvent bank put into bankruptcy when it had no debts? It had no loans, had no past due bills. It was all part of a grand plan to make it look like the bank helped customers launder money and evade taxes. So the IRS and the J5 could take credit for shutting down a bank that laundered money and evaded taxes, even if the bank didn't do the things that they were claiming it did, so it could take credit for shutting it down. Right? This was a huge criminal conspiracy that took place. Not only did I lose my constitutional rights, was I deprived of my property without any due process, and was I also deprived of my presumption of innocence without a trial. Right? I mean, at least in Trump's case, he got a phony trial. I didn't even get that. I mean, these corrupt government officials couldn't even get an indictment against me or anyone in my bank. Right? Normally, you can indict a ham sandwich, but they couldn't even do that because that's how innocent my bank was. So instead of just saying, well, I guess we got it wrong, Schiff's bank didn't do anything wrong, they said, well, you know what? Schiff's bank didn't do anything wrong, but let's pretend it did something wrong. Let's put the bank out of business so we can pretend it did something wrong, so we can look good, so we can pretend that our failed investigation was a success. So let's shut this whole bank down. Let's stop this sale from taking place. Let's steal this guy's property. And in the process, we're going to screw over thousands of innocent customers who have now been deprived of their deposits. Some of my customers had their life savings in my bank, and they've had no access to that money for now almost 2 years. But I went on to ChatGPT, and I want to find the result. And you can do this yourselves too, right? Because anybody with ChatGPT can go and ask this question. But so I was looking for information on the press conference. So here's what I asked ChatGPT. This is my question. On April 30th, 2022, OSIF held a press conference in Puerto Rico with IRS Chief Jim Lee, Simon York, and Will Day. Can you find any transcripts of that press conference online? Now, here's what ChatGPT responded. I was unable to locate a full transcript of the April 30th, 2022 press conference held by the OSIF in Puerto Rico with IRS Chief Jim Lee, Simon York, and Will Day. However, I did find detailed summaries of the press conference and the actions discussed. Okay, so it looked over the internet and was able to figure out what happened to my bank based on the reports of what happened to my bank. Now, here's what ChatGPT wrote. The press conference was focused on the shutdown of Euro Pacific International Bank for facilitating officer or tax evasion and money laundering. So in other words, my bank was shut down for facilitating officer tax evasion and money laundering when that had nothing to do with it officially, because it was exonerated of that. It was shut down for not having enough capital. But ChatGPT doesn't know that. Jim Lee, the IRS chief of criminal investigations, highlighted the coordinated international efforts that led to this action. Well, but they claimed there was no coordination. But here, based on the press accounts, ChatGPT is saying coordination. Although there were no indictments, the bank's operations were suspended to deter further illegal activity. What do you mean to deter further activity? Illegal activity. There was no illegal activity. There was no illegal activity at all at my bank. If there was illegal activity, somebody would have been charged with a crime. See, how do you have illegal activity without criminal behavior, right? If there was something illegal, then somebody at my bank did something illegal and they would have been indicted. The whole purpose of opening up a grand jury was to get an indictment. That was the goal. So if there was illegal activity, the people who were doing the illegal activity would have been charged with those crimes. So here, ChatGPT thinks that my bank was doing illegal activity, even though nobody was indicted, because that's the way it was reported, because that's the way the IRS and the J5 and OSIF wanted it to be reported. They deliberately created the false impression that my bank was guilty of crimes they knew it did not commit, because they tried to get indictments and they couldn't because there was no evidence. Here's the rest of what they wrote. The press conference also emphasized the role of the Joint Chiefs of Global Tax Enforcement, J5, which includes the tax authorities from the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands in these enforcement actions. So now they're claiming that all these J5 nations had a role in OSIF's decision to shut down my bank. But of course, officially, they claimed that those countries had no role, that OSIF's actions were independent. Well, I now know that they weren't independent because, again, I finally got proof in my heavily redacted FOIA response that the IRS and OSIF coordinated and collaborated and conspired to shut down my bank and hold a press conference to frame it for tax evasion and money laundering over 3 months before it actually happened. So they were lying to us for months and months and months, allowing us to believe that a sale was still being considered when it had already been rejected. But it wasn't rejected for honest reasons. It was rejected for illegal reasons. And they had to come up with a pretense to justify it. So we've got all these examples. I've got my own personal experience with corruption in government. And now you have another example with respect to Donald Trump and that sham trial. And the fact that you've got so many people, claiming, oh, this is good. I mean, this shows that, there's justice and Donald Trump got some kind of fair trial. I mean, this is preposterous. And we look ridiculous on the national stage doing stuff like this. But the whole country, is unraveling when the judicial system is so corrupted and so unfair. And people lose confidence in the judicial system. right? That we're not a nation of laws. We're a nation of men. We're a nation of very corrupt men. Okay, men and women. I don't want to, gender this thing. It's both sexes that are equally culpable in the degradation of our country. But this is a big deal. And in fact, it's reason enough, even if you don't like Trump. And, Trump is not our savior, right? Trump's not going to get elected and make inflation go away. It's going to get worse, regardless of who gets reelected. But just to stop the corruption in the legal system is reason enough to vote for Trump. Because you can't sanction what has taken place. And you can't allow the judicial system to be perverted in the way that it has. Now, I'm hoping I can do something with respect to what happened to me and what happened to thousands of innocent customers who banked with me. So hopefully I'll be able to get some kind of vindication. I got minimal vindication from my defamation lawsuit, which I won in Australia and which the media covered up. They had no problem reporting when I was falsely accused of crimes. But when I sued the newspaper that accused me and won, oh, no, they don't want to cover that story. So that's the complicit media, which is also helping to advance, the phony charges against Trump. So I wasn't able to get any kind of real vindication other than my followers know that I won. In fact, my followers never really doubted me. It's like I didn't have to convince my followers that they lied, right? People trusted me and they could see through the sham of 60 Minutes Australia. People don't even realize how bad it was. It wasn't just defamation. They just flat out lied. And even in their newspaper, because the judge ruled that the newspaper article in The Age wasn't defamatory about me personally, right? And I think she got that wrong. And I think the second judge, Judge Jackman, would not have ruled that way. And had I appealed, I probably would have won. But even though it wasn't, in theory, defamatory of me personally, it certainly was defamatory of the bank. But the bank couldn't sue for defamation. It was just me personally. And it was loaded with lies. There were like 50 or 60 false statements in that article. False, outright lies that their own evidence proved were lies. I didn't even have to prove that the reporters lied. Their own evidence proved they lied. They had the truth in front of them and they lied anyway. It wasn't like I had to present the truth at the trial. They already had it. They shared it with me in discovery. And so it was way worse than just defamation. But, I got vindication to my own group of followers. Most people in Australia who saw that 60 Minutes broadcast have no idea that it was ruled defamatory and they had to take it down, right? Because there's been like a media blackout of my win to whitewash the reputations of these corrupt reporters, Charlie Grieve and Nick McKenzie. And by the way, I keep calling them corrupt. I call them liars. I call them frauds. You'll notice they don't sue me for defamation. They can't because I got a perfect defense. It's true, right? And so I can say all the stuff I want because I can prove it's true. They can't say it about me because I could sue them for defamation because it's to be false. But hopefully I can get some vindication. I'm working on that now, and I will keep everybody informed as to any kind of progress I can make as far as some type of legal vindication in the U.S. for the crimes that were committed, not just against me, but against thousands of innocent customers of Europe Pacific Bank. Anyway, that's it for now. I'll be back again later in the week with more podcasts. So stick around, and I'm glad you guys were able to finally participate or hear this Sunday night podcast. Take care.